Okay, so today we have a very special guest here. This is Jessica with National Tent Structures. She essentially knows everything about tents. And the reason I wanted to do this recording was because there's so many times I'll have a new bride consultation or even working in the design aspects with our clients, and people always say, well, I just want to do something simple and have a tent. And it's not simple. And I try to explain, like, well, it's not that simple. It's so like multifaceted. There's so much that goes on with this. And then people are like, well, what does it cost? And there's no like cost. Like there's not like a thing where it's like, oh, well, a tent is this amount. It's like, well, do you want flooring? Do you want sides? Do you want, we'll get into all of this, but I wanted to go through a bunch of like frequently asked questions that I get so you can hear it from the expert herself on all of the tent needs. So, hi.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, one of the biggest things is, like I had mentioned, the cost. How do you determine cost, and what are all of the things that go into determining what the cost is? Like all the variables.
There are a lot of variables.
Yeah.
I think the first thing to consider really is what are we looking at in terms of guest count? How many square foot do we need? Once we kind of determine the main things that we need to cover to accommodate the scenario, then we get into the design aspect. And that's a whole other ball game, from ceiling treatments and drape treatments to lighting, and do we want a clear tent? Do we want to make sure that we're embracing the views of the venue or the space? Do we really need to look at something that elevates the guest experience and the attendee experience and go into something along the lines of an atrium or something a little bit more luxury and high end? So there are definitely a lot of
There's
variables.
so many.
So
Even things like as far as doors, like a standard tent, if you have sides on it, is gonna have like a pullback Velcro piece for a door, right?
Yes.
Unless you want to add doors to it. So it's like all of these details that you don't even think about that are so important when determining, and all affect what the price can be. And then that doesn't even mention heating, cooling, draping, lighting. I mean, there's just everything that can be brought in because you're essentially building a venue. So when you go into our venues and it's like a brick and mortar, like an actual building with all the working things in it, you take that for granted when you decide to do it like in a field.
And climate control is one of the big things as well to consider, really, when you're doing your preliminary research and trying to figure out square footage and what we need to accommodate. The climate control is really a necessity in terms of, it can be both air conditioning, it can be heating. We'll need to allocate.
You get like actual thermostats. Like they're so venue driven. Like if you make
you're building a building,
yeah.
really, you are.
Yeah.
And then power. What do we need for lighting? What do we need to run the HVAC? What do the caterers need? What else does the DJ need? It's kind of a snowball effect, but I think that if you're working with a professional, they'll really walk you through it and make sure that you're covering all of your bases.
Yeah. And then all of this goes into, of course, what this costs. Can you give a range of, if we have 100 guests, let's say, a range of what a tent could cost? And it doesn't have to be anything specific, like a literal range, so then that way it makes sense, like why you can't just get a quick quote on a tent.
For 100 guests, I would probably allocate a minimum of $20,000 just as a starting point, and consider that the basics. That is the frame, that is the canopy, that's going to cover you from weather elements, and create your designated space.
Yes.
And I would say that can range for 100 people up to over $100,000, only because, again, you're customizing this to your vision and bringing this to reality. So whether that be fabric treatments or custom wall facades or
flooring,
chandeliers, flooring,
yeah.
There's a lot.
It is. It's so crazy. And then what is the most popular type of tent right now?
I would say the atrium tent is definitely the most popular right now. It is weatherproof, it's weather resistant. The aluminum is powder coated, so it creates a nice look. You can have black beams rather than exposed aluminum.
So like those black glass house looking tents, that's the atrium.
The glass wall.
You guys have seen them all over.
The glass wall, the clear tops, a lot of ornamentation and design goes into that.
Okay. And then what all goes into a setup process for a tent like that? Like how, so designing it, setup.
I think the first thing that we always want to consider is what's all going to go under it, right? Do we need to accommodate for dancing? Do we need to accommodate for dance floors and bars along with the guest seating? Once we kind of get an idea of what needs to go under that, whether we're adding lounge vignettes or creating a patio space for that, then we can go into the design. I think accessibility to the site logistically also needs to be taken into consideration.
Yes. Can we get in there?
Are we in a parking lot or are we on the side of the mountain? And both have been done. And both have turned out really beautiful, but we just have to plan logistically to accommodate the venue's guidelines or what they need to see from their vendors, whether there's guest rooms around. How long do we need to build it? Are we going to need to get this done overnight, which can be done? Or are we going to have 3 or 4 full days, because we'll want to do a full day for flooring and then a couple days for the tent, and we want to allow all of the other vendors time to get their florals in. We'll get the tables and chairs and linens down and the tables dressed, but there's a lot of planning, I would say, from the get-go, logistically and timeline-wise, that we'll want to take into consideration for production.
Yeah. What is the biggest size tent you've ever done?
Structures are up to 50 meters right now, which is 164 foot wide. 164 foot wide. And we can go in length however long that it needs to be. So we have done very large tents in 50 meters for a lot of disaster relief and emergency response. The other thing that we commonly do in the sports and entertainment field is a double decker. So not only not only are you having the square footage on the bottom, but you're doubling that because you have the same amount of square footage on the top.
So tents can be 2 stories?
Tents can be 3 stories.
Oh.
Tents can be 2 stories.
This is really exciting.
3 stories. Commonly for sports and entertainment, we'll build out hospitality spaces, and the bottoms will be glass wall, climate controlled. The top will be more viewing and open air with a railing package. They come with stairs. But it's a good way to double your square footage and build up if you don't have the footprint to build out.
That's so cool. And now my design mind is going crazy. So stay tuned for a double-decker wedding and a
after
tent,
party.
because that's going to happen, absolutely. But I asked that question because a lot of times brides will say, like, well, will my guests even fit in a tent? Well, yes, they will. No matter what, they will fit in a tent. So that is really good to know. Okay, so let's describe a very inexpensive tent, and then let's describe a very expensive tent. So like the difference between the two of them. So an inexpensive tent obviously would be smaller in size, maybe no design elements.
A little bit more bare, I would say, in terms of design. It can be as small as a 10 by 10, which gives you 100 square foot. A lot of times those are used for catering or back of house. In the sports and entertainment world, you'll see them sometimes on holes on golf courses. But basic and most cost effective, I would say, you're gonna see aluminum poles exposed. You're not gonna see the pretty and the drape and the fabric. In terms of getting more costly, I would say I did a wedding that the venue did not have a large space to accommodate the guest count. It was over 300 people. And they actually were open to thinking outside of the box and moved into the parking lot. And when I say moved into the parking lot, you automatically are like, ew.
No, I've done that before. You
but
literally
we
moved into the parking lot.
We built a building in a parking lot. You never would have known if you were inside that it was a tent. We did a walkway tent to it. You didn't really see tent walls. They had built custom, we fabricated custom facades.
That's so cool.
The ceiling treatment was all fabric, so you couldn't see any beams or aluminum. And the flooring, we built a level floor because the ground was unlevel, so we built out a level floor, and then we covered it with a wood look. And it
that
really
sounds gorgeous.
You walk in and you're like,
so you essentially can make your own venue. So for all of my lovely ladies that go touring and they're like, well, I don't like this, I don't like that.
You absolutely
can
make your own venue.
You can actually make the entire thing, which will be really good. So let's give advice to a bride who's budgeting for it.
So for any brides that are considering a tent or getting married in any outdoor space, I think the number one thing to consider is always plan for a weather backup. Because if you don't plan for when you're going to need it, and if you plan for when your life is going to be
so
much
easy.
much
Yeah.
more breezy.
But on the flip side of that, when you're planning for a weather backup, you want to put these you want to have an idea in mind. So basically like a starting kind of cost for a weather backup. But because there are so many intricacies that go into this, you really want to start pulling the trigger if you're watching the weather and you're seeing all of this, just because there's so much that goes into
There is
the actual details.
multiple days
But
of
knowing
build
what it is, just initially and kind of having the conversations, I feel like are extremely important.
Yeah, and if you're working with an expert planner, they're going to walk you through that and make sure that you're covered. I think the one thing to remember is that your space is truly customizable.
Yeah.
So you send the inspo pictures, you talk through the ideas. I love this idea, but I'm not a huge fan of this.
Mhm.
We can design that and make that work with you guys.
Yeah.
But I think the more inspiration that we have in terms of what your vision is, the better we can help bring that to a reality.
Absolutely. Well, this pretty much sums up our interview about all of our attendee questions. So if you guys have anything additional that you would like answers for, just